ready.
You don't think so? No, they're not at that point, but I would try.
Any effort to sort of say they are is going to some define what they're doing.
Chantal, are you ready? Do you want me to? Witness mic 1, witness mic 2, witness mic check, Yeah. Witness mic 1, witness mic 2, check, sound check, sound check. Might have your, what do you have it set on? Did you take off the? Sound check 1, sound check 2, witness mic, witness mic. Witness mic, witness, I think so, yeah. Here, let me do. Member mic 1, member mic 2, sound check, member mic, sound check 1, sound check 2. Member mic 1, sound check 1, sound check 2. Member check 1, member check 2. Member mic check, check 1, check 2, check 3. My voice is probably lower than the members would be. Check 1, check 2, sound check 1, sound check 2. February 28, 2017, sound check 1, sound check 2.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing audio 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Audio check. What are you at? Testing 1, 2, 3. Audio check 1, 2, 3.
You were still in the green, but it was a nice big swing.
Do we want to shut those doors? Or? Okay. We're going to call this meeting to order. And it's an honor. This will be the first committee hearing on the Asia Pacific Subcommittee. And it's an honor to be the chairman. And I welcome you guys here and thank you for being part of this committee and allowing me to be at the helm of it. Good afternoon and welcome to the first meeting of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific of the 115th Congress. The subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing. Without objections, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, extraneous material for the record, subject to length limitations in the rules. The People's Republic of China's aggressive and provocative behavior in the maritime territorial disputes represents a threat to vital U.S. interests as severe as those from Russia, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism from the Middle East. According to the Heritage Foundation's 2017 Index for U.S. Military Strength, since 2013, China has rapidly advanced its maritime capabilities, employed them to transform the South China Sea with artificial islands, place Japan under increasing pressure in the East China Sea, and attempt to restrict freedoms of navigation in its near waters. Unbelievably, China has suffered little, if any, cost for this maritime push. In the South China Sea, China has built over 3,200 acres of land over disputed features in the Spratly Islands, complete with military-capable airstrips, ports, radars, anti-aircraft weapons, and confirmed just last week surface-to-air missile silos. China also continues to press the Japanese vessels around the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. Uncommitted to existing global norms, China continually undermines attempts at a unified response to these activities from the ASEAN and has attempted to use its economic influence to buy off other claimants. The United States and our allies and partners recognize that our military presence in the Western Pacific has been a force for stability and for good across decades. But so far, we haven't acted with nearly the level of resolve that China has in its aggressive pursuit of its arbitrary claims. For example, officials from the last administration proclaimed the importance of freedom of navigation far and wide in response to China's effort to restrict it. But this fundamental right and the international law which protects it was only hesitantly enforced with 4 freedom of navigation operations, none of which challenged China's tacit assertions that its artificial islands are entitled to territorial seas. For nearly a decade, we have said much and done little. While the South and East China Seas may seem distant, we have important national interests at stake. The disputed areas are key global economic and trade arteries. Nearly 30% of the world's maritime trade moves through the area. Domination of these routes might allow a regional power to use disruption as leverage. The security of these areas is also essential for the energy security of key U.S. defense allies and partners. Most of the energy supplies of South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan come through the South China Sea. Energy insecurity among our friends in the region could have serious implications for our ability to handle potential contingencies arising from North Korea and elsewhere. Perhaps most importantly, the lack of U.S. resolve hasn't just allowed China to change the status quo on the ground, but contributes to worries among our allies and partners that the United States lacks sufficient commitment to the region and feeds the narrative that China has been successful in degrading U.S. influences and global norms. The perceived potency of our military and diplomatic power is very much at risk. The South and East China Seas are strategic keys to East Asia, and acquiescence to restrictions on U.S. forces' freedom of operations there will undermine the U.S. security guaranteed and degrade both regional and world stability. We need a new strategy, and the entrance of a new administration represents a good opportunity to form and implement better policies to represent or reassert U.S. strengths in these critical areas. It may be time to consider an assertive plan. As we have seen endlessly, backing away from conflicts carries its own risk. China has taken advantage of U.S. acquiescence to revise the status quo, advancing its strategic interests in ways that raises the risks of conflict. Timidity hasn't de-escalated these maritime disputes. It has only raised the stakes. Today, we'll hear from suggestions from our expert panel for defining U.S. goals and addressing China's maritime push, as well as policy options to operationalize more effective U.S. engagement on this important issue. And at this moment, without objections, the witness written statement will be entered into the hearing record, and I now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Sherman, for any remarks he may have.
Chairman Yoho, thanks for those remarks. Welcome to your new role. I look forward to working with you, and you will find, as you already know, that I am hawkish on our trade relationship with China and dovish on the so-called islands, more reefs than anything else. China is waging every day an attack on American working families by refusing to accept our exports and by demanding co-production agreements when they will take a few of our exports, demanding that we transfer factories and technology as a price for having some limited access to their markets. That is devastating state after state in America, and instead we're focused on these islets. Why? Well, because the most powerful economic decision makers in America is Wall Street, and they want us to ignore the devastation of America's working families. And the most important decision maker in the area of our military and national security is the Pentagon and others who want to see a 10% increase in our defense budget. And they know that China is the only worthy adversary to the might of the American military. So I do think it's important that we look at our bilateral relations with China, and the aggression of China in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, is an irritant. And maritime disputes and our support for a free international maritime regime is important. If it was more important, we might join UNCLOS and actually be part of the international order when it comes to maritime disputes. Instead, we focus all of our attention on China's refusal to adhere to international law on these disputes. There are 20 maritime disputes that do not involve China, and not a single one of them has been the subject or even a partial subject of any hearing of this subcommittee, any subcommittee, or the full committee of Foreign Affairs. Why? Because none of those disputes justify a massive increase in the American military budget, and none of those disputes distract us sufficiently from the war that China is waging against American working families. Now, we're told that these islands pose this great threat to international trade because $5 trillion of trade goes close to these islets or reefs. Yes, almost all that trade is going in and out of Chinese ports, and if China controlled these reefs, they could blockade their own ports, and what threat, witnesses, does that pose to American national security? Now, some of that trade are oil tankers coming from Saudi Arabia to Japan, and in a worst-case scenario, and I do not add, where China somehow dominated wrongfully and tried to interdict in this area, those tankers would have to change their course, thus increasing the cost of gasoline in Japan by at least 1/10 of 1 cent per gallon. That's the worst that could happen to international trade. As if they could blockade their own ports, they could force some trade to go a little on a slightly different route, and that's a level of aggression that I don't think any of us would tolerate. So let me see. Finally, we've got to look at burden sharing. Japan demands that we risk lives to defend these uninhabited islets, and that we spend billions and apparently need to shut down a third of our State Department to be able to afford to do it, to defend these islets. They spend less than 1% of their GDP on defense. We have to defend their islets. There's no oil there, but if there is any oil there, it's Japan's oil or South Korea's oil. It's not our oil. But also, What happened to our mutual defense treaty when America was attacked on 9/11? Our European partners at least put troops in harm's way. Some of them are spending 2% of their GDP on defense. Japan said, well, we've got this constitution, so we won't help you, and we won't amend our constitution either to help you. So Americans died by the thousands, a country with a mutual defense treaty with the United States binding them to help defend us, basically ignored. I think there was a ship in the Indian Ocean that had a Japanese flag on it. So we are told that the Pentagon needs more money to defend islands that Japan is unwilling to tax itself to defend, a country that responded rather insufficiently when America was attacked. And we are told, don't pay attention to China's attack on American working families. Pay only attention to whether they're adding a little dirt to a reef in the South China Sea. I yield back.
I appreciate my colleagues' comments there, and yes, there are a lot of other conflicts or areas that are concern out there. But when we start seeing military equipment going in there, land strips and things like that, I think it causes more concern in this issue, and I look forward to the dialogue. And at this point, I'd like to yield a minute to my colleague, Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
And congratulations, Mr. Chairman,
Thank you.
on being Mr. Chairman. Let's just note that President Abe in Japan has been doing his best to end the type of relationship that you have just described. President Abe and the people of Japan are honorable people, and they are courageous people when they have to defend their interests. We have been doing that, and we've insisted upon that all since the end of the Second World War. President Abe is moving forward now and trying to move through his parliament an end to the restrictions that were placed on Japan by their constitution after the Second World War. I think that and we should applaud that. I don't know if, certainly the last administration did not applaud it, and I would hope that President Trump would indeed look at what Abe's trying to do to become an equal partner rather than a junior partner who's being taken care of. So we should applaud that. And second of all, in terms of what's going on with the Chinese, if we turn our back and just say, that doesn't affect us, what we're talking about is an arrogant disruption of international right-of-ways, both in the air and on the sea, that will do nothing but embolden this rotten dictatorship in Beijing from moving forward with even more aggressive moves elsewhere.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to Mr. Barra, Dr. Barra from California.
Thank you. And I want to add my congratulations,
Thank you.
Chairman Yoho, and welcome back to the ranking member. I think this is a timely topic for us to start this session of Congress off and this subcommittee off. I was in Japan last week, had a chance to meet with the Prime Minister.
Code of conduct. The Chinese have committed themselves to this. They're supposed to have a framework for a code of conduct by the middle of this year. The United States barely says a thing about it. It needs to base itself on the 2002 declaration that ASEAN and China reached, and then use that as the basis for moving forward for a code of conduct that will cover a lot of these areas.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to afford Mr. Sherman 30 seconds.
One comment is that we might be stronger diplomatically if we were part of UNCLOS. We don't subscribe to the international standards for maritime disputes, but we demand China do so. But I want to pick up on what Mr. Cheng said. They do need to manipulate their domestic public opinion. They will especially need to do that if economic conditions change and they can no longer develop, provide 5 or 10% economic growth. And if there's a recession in China, the best or the most likely way for them to try to retain power is to go eyeball to eyeball with us and wrap themselves in nationalism. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, we'll go to Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I know this goes back a ways. It's probably longer than most people care to think about, and maybe it's not even relevant to today's conversation. But I always think for historical purposes, it's important that we remind ourselves in a way how we got here. And I'm one of the people that believes that a United States diplomat named John Service and the fall of Chiang Kai-shek as opposed to Mao, and our State Department and our meddling on the behalf of communists have helped create the problem that we now find ourselves within. And I just think it's important to think about those things, because I see parallels to today with some other places we're engaged in, other things we're doing. That having been said, I'd like to turn to Mr. Cheng. Our new Secretary of State, Tillerson, warned of a more confrontational South China Sea policy, but also said that the island building had to stop and that access to those islands would not be allowed. The President has recognized the one China policy, as we all know. The last administration expressed a floor for China, including the militarization of the South China Sea. But as far as I can tell, that was never backed up, never backed up in the last with any action. So the question is, so if we're going to maintain that there is a floor for China, what specific conditions should we articulate to China regarding that? And when China invariably breaks the floor or floors, what should our actions be?
Congressman, I think that to begin with, we should be treating our allies and our friends at least as well as we treat China. So I think that the incorporation of China into things like RIMPAC, when forces from, for example, the Republic of China, Taiwan, are excluded, sends, I think, a very distinct message to Beijing, especially when they show up not only with the forces that are supposed to show up, but also spy ships, which were uninvited. And yet we are apparently going to invite them yet again. They showed up in 2014 with a spy ship as well as their forces. They showed up in 2016. And now apparently we're going to invite them again in 2018. That isn't even a floor. That's not a net. That's an open doorway. I think that with regards to confrontation, again, there are economic aspects that can be undertaken. The companies that are doing this reclamation should be given a fairly simple choice. You can work for China and make millions, or you can work the global market that the US, Europe, and Japan can influence, and that's billions of dollars. I think many of these companies may well at least impose pressure on their own system to rethink some of their policies. And then with regards to our allies, again, I think that many of them are still militarily less capable. They want to cooperate with the United States. We are representing the gold standard. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaging diplomatically. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaging in other aspects, but these are things that also do send a political signal as well, whether it is sales of more advanced weapons or whether it is cooperating in military, inviting our friends and allies to cooperate in multinational military exercises.
So that seems pretty proactive. I mean, not inviting the Chinese, maybe we continue to invite them, but we also invite our allies, is what you're saying. But I would say that there also should be an immediate prohibition of bringing the spy ship, if you want to call it that, right? That seems pretty axiomatic, as well as making the contractors make a choice, right? That seems pretty obvious as well. But those are kind of prospective, right? We could make that decision right now. But anticipating that China will always step one foot closer. What's in our arsenal of diplomatic, and maybe arsenal's not the right term, right? But what's in our grab bag of options to something that will be meaningful to China when it's either imposed upon them or taken away from them, et cetera?
Congressman, I think that, again, access to our markets is something that China wants as much as we want access to theirs. Financial markets in particular, we in an odd way represent sort of the underwriter's limited seal of approval when a Chinese IPO occurs. And the inability to access our stock markets, our financial networks, is something that should be undertaken very carefully, because that is a very, very serious step. But it does send a very serious message to Beijing. If you want to still benefit from that global transfer of funds that undergirds your economy, then you need to play by the rules that you have already signed up to play by.
Always a privilege, Mr. Cheng. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Ms. Titus from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps we shouldn't have been so anxious to send Bao Bao back if we are facing these kind of diplomatic problems. All of you have mentioned that we need to increase our engagement in the South China Sea, and all of you have mentioned we need to do this through diplomacy, not just with China, but with our other allies there. You pointed that out, Mr. Cheng. Dr. Osland said, I think your quote was, energetic diplomacy through ASEAN or attending some of these other summits. And then, Dr. Swain, you noted the only effective way to create a more stable environment in the maritime areas near China is for the U.S. to lead a serious diplomatic dialogue with Beijing and others in the area. You kind of trumped my question there in passing in your earlier answer, but I'd like to hear all of you say, how in the world are we going to be able to increase diplomacy, not just with China, but the other areas, when we have no clear message coming out of the White House? We have so many vacancies at top levels in the State Department, and we have what we anticipate a budget from this new president where they are just cutting as much as they can from the State Department. Are we not creating a power vacuum there? How are we going to deal with this situation? Maybe Dr. Swain, you could start.
Well, you're preaching to the choir on this. I mean, I think we don't know yet, right, exactly what the Trump administration intends to do by way of cutting back in order to pay for a $54 billion increase in defense spending. It's claiming that it's going to have offsets to be able to do this without having to raise taxes or increase the deficit. I don't know what that means.
We do know he wants other people to step up and do their share, so that's kind of a hint of what's coming.
So gutting agencies, EPA and the State Department, and to me it's just incredibly foolish if that's what's going to happen, because the State Department, more than any other agency, needs to have more funding. It has been operating on a shoestring for way too long, and to put them at a lesser level of spending is going to make the ability of the United States to really be effective in places like the Far East where it really counts much, much less. So I don't in any way sanction or endorse the kind of direction where the administration is going today. I think there has to be a clear strategic assessment about what our long-term future is in the Western Pacific and how we bring to bear our most important assets, diplomatic, military, economic, to achieve those gains. Much of U.S. policy has to do with process. Engagement is a process, as if it's something we can do or not do. We have no alternative to engaging with the Chinese. The Chinese are so big and so influential, and the rest of the world is so committed to dealing with them that efforts by us to try and cut back on that would be totally self-destructive. So we have to get smart about how we're going to be more engaged on this in a very changing dynamic for power relations, particularly in the Western Pacific. That's the only real area where the United States and China, in my view, can have serious problems. It's not over larger questions globally. It's primarily in the Western Pacific. And if we don't get that right, things are going to affect many, many other areas. So I agree that we need to have greater capabilities on the diplomatic side and on the economic side.
We've seen visiting some new democracies where China has moved in there very eagerly to build infrastructure. And if you start cutting back at the State Department, cutting back the small budget that is foreign aid, this can have repercussions beyond the South China Sea. Mr. Chin or Dr. Osland?
Congresswoman, just on your last point, I agree. We don't do infrastructure. We do capacity building. So if you want judges or police, you come to us. You want a road, you want a school, a power plant, you go to China or Japan. We should be doing infrastructure. We have spent decades, however, to get to your earlier point, we have spent decades stripping our capability of spreading a democratic message about our values and our society and our culture. USIA, U.S. Information Agency, was disestablished years ago and rolled into the State Department. The current cuts may be extreme, but they're part of a long trend under both Democratic and Republican administrations to make it harder for our diplomats to get our message out. We do need to turn that around. I believe in it, but it is only part of a solution. And as much as we need to engage with China, we have to be realistic. A country that wants to cooperate or be cooperative will do so without our blandishments. We have to understand the limitations of that even as we pursue it, because it sends a message to others who want to emulate our ways. Thank you.
I guess I'm out of time. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Gabbard from the great state of Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and sharing your insights and thoughts. No one's really talked about North Korea yet and how the various courses of action that are being suggested here will impact the very direct threat that we face from North Korea and the reality that any resolution to North Korea's situation will require the engagement and cooperation of China in that. So I'd love to just hear each of your thoughts on specifically how you suggest your suggested course of action will impact and the threat we face from North Korea. We start with Dr. Chang.
Representative, frankly, I don't see any solution to North Korea. Because the North Korean regime has associated itself with retaining its nuclear capability, and China has repeatedly demonstrated for pretty much the last 30 years it has no intention of solving the North Korean problem, particularly for the United States. And the reality is that North Korea's nuclear weapons aren't aimed at China. They are aimed at Japan, South Korea, and the United States, which from the Chinese perspective is not a great solution, but not necessarily a particularly troubling one. I will note, however, that the one time that anything was done that truly caught the North Korean regime's attention was when we shut down Banco Delta Asia by using the financial networks to force the Chinese, again, to make that choice. The millions of dollars that they gained from working with North Korea were the billions of dollars in financial flows that would otherwise occur. Unfortunately, after less than a year, we decided that those sanctions were too dangerous to continue and sustain against North Korea.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, thank you. I'd agree with my colleague. I would say, however, I'd modify it slightly to say that there are no good solutions to North Korea. There are lots of bad solutions to North Korea. And I agree entirely that we have to give up the fiction that China wants in any way to solve North Korea, certainly for our own purposes. I would say, however, that given the increasing erratic nature of the Kim Jong-un regime, the assassination of his half-brother, who was protected by China just a few weeks ago in Malaysia, as well as the assassination in 2014 or 13 of Chang Song-tek, who was Kim Jong-un's uncle, but more importantly, China's main agent in North Korea, means that Beijing is as worried about their influence as we are worried about our lack of. And there may be opportunities out of pure self-interest, which is a fine thing, for the two of us to figure out ways of pressuring that regime, or at least talking more creatively about how to contain it. At some point, by the way, we are going to have to decide when we declare it a nuclear power. It is a nuclear power. I understand that we do not want to shred the nonproliferation regime, but we're going to have to wake up to reality one day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with what Dean and Misha have said already, that this is not a problem with a solution. I mean, it's really trying to maximize or optimize a bad situation. And unfortunately, what drives this situation the most is the behavior of North Korea, which no country outside of North Korea has real control over, including the Chinese. I believe that the Chinese have moved in their position towards a greater degree of cooperation and support in dealing with North Korea. They certainly wouldn't fully endorse everything that the United States might want to see toward North Korea for legitimate national security interests of their own, as well as other interests which may not be, as from our perspective, as legitimate. But I do think that we have choices here. We have the policy thus far has not worked. So we need to think about a new way of addressing this issue. We can't simply regard the Chinese as being the panacea, that they're going to solve it, because they're not going to solve it. So we have to think about how we can work with the Chinese, the South Koreans, and the Japanese to deal with it. We have two different paths that we can go. One of them is towards a greater degree of unified sanctions against North Korea in the hope that the regime will collapse or give up its nuclear weapons. I think that's very unlikely. I think they're committed to these weapons, and they're not likely to give them up. And they're going to continue to move towards a deliverable ICBM capability with a nuclear warhead. And when they get close to that capability, the question is, what do we do about that? And in my view, the only thing that one can do is you have to make a choice between being, well, you can combine both. You can be extremely clear about the consequences of any use or threat of use of a nuclear weapon by North Korea, that it involved the destruction of North Korea, and that this applies to threats to South Korea and to Japan, our allies, for whom we have a nuclear umbrella. And at the same time, however, I think we have to consider whether or not it's possible to develop a diplomatic strategy in which you address each of the concerns that the North Koreans have said that they have on their security front. Many people say this is all useless because the North Koreans will ignore all this and continue to take advantage of it. But you can make the argument that the United States and the other powers have not fully tried to implement what you call an omnibus approach to North Korea that would give them, over a period of time, in response to certain actions that they would take, a certain level of benefits for them, economic and diplomatic. And if they turn those things down and you offer them all in good faith and the Chinese sign on to that, then the basis for the Chinese to continue to not cooperate in dealing with North Korea will be reduced, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
There are clearly no easy answers to the situation, but Dr. Swain, I would argue that the time to ask that question, what will we do, is now, and understand that as we look at these other issues, whether it be the South China Sea or other issues within the region, we can't operate in a silo with any of them because of the ripple effects that will occur as we look at the various threats that exist there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And they've called votes. We've got 10.5 minutes, and I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Connolly from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd welcome our panelists. And if we can all be concise, I'd appreciate it because we're going to go vote. My concern is, at the very start of the new administration, we have seen, or we are seeing, policies that contradict each other with respect to this region and China. So we rattle the cage with a call to the President of Taiwan. We announce a budget that's going to add $54 billion in defense spending, and the purpose of which is for shipbuilding, military aircraft, and establishing, quote, a more robust presence in key international waterways and checkpoints, unquote, like the South China Sea, while saying we're going to fund that by cutting back on the State Department and AID specifically. Now, I was just in Sri Lanka. The Chinese, as you said, Dr. Osland, are building everything in, ports, airports, roads, bridges, high-rises, sports stadiums, hospitals. They're building it. But we're financing democratization. We're providing real in-depth assistance, both through IRI and NDI, to help, frankly, democratize institutions in Sri Lanka, and it's working. But that's funded through the aid program. Now, if we retrench in our foreign assistance and diplomatic posture in places like the Philippines, Vietnam, Burma, Sri Lanka, doesn't that create a vacuum for the Chinese? And before you answer, so that's one vacuum I'm worried about and one set of contradictions. The other is, in the first week, we rip up TPP. And what's happening as we speak? Beijing has summoned a region-wide convocation to talk about a new trade agreement that has zero provisions on labor, on human rights, and on the environment. And I don't know, I'm a simple soul, but that seems like we just contradicted ourselves and frankly handed an enormous victory to the Chinese that will be very long-lasting. Your comments.
Representative, I believe that TPP was negotiated by the previous administration that indicated that it was not going to bring it forward to Congress. It was not going to present it for a vote at all. And in counting noses over who would have voted, I not sure how many members of the previous administration's party could be relied upon to vote for TPP.
Irrelevant point, Mr. Chang. I'm making a different point. And by the way, I happen to be one of those people who would have and did. However, what I'm making, and if you don't want to answer it, then I'll move to Dr. Oslin and Dr. Swain. The question is, are we not handing an enormous victory, irrespective of what Obama's administration was prepared to do or not do? They were prepared to bring it to a vote, but time kind of ran out. But didn't we just hand the Chinese an enormous victory? And isn't the witness of that what's happening as we speak in Beijing? 30% of all of the world's economic activity is going to be covered by the agreement they're now forging. And I might add U.S. allies like Australia and New Zealand. Maybe Australia isn't an ally anymore after the tongue lashing they got from the new president. But Dr. Oslin, did you want to comment?
Congressman, I would prefer to see the administration go back to TPP. However, if all we can get are bilaterals, and I think we should all push as strongly as possible to get bilaterals, starting with Japan. Your point about the aid vacuum, I think, is important. It is an important part of our strategy. I would prefer to see that part of the budget increased as well. But we have to do a lot better at the messaging that we send out. We have not been very good under either Democratic or Republican administrations in the State Department sending out those messages. Thank you.
Dr. Swain, real quickly, because we're running out of time.
No, I basically agree with that, but I think the United States does really have to have a much better job, do a much better job of presenting what the economic costs and benefits are and what the advantages the United States gets from multilateral trade agreements, but it's just not in the position of doing that.
I just have never seen the United States quite so blatantly in the matter of 1 month contradict itself so profoundly with respect to something so important, namely our relations with China. So on the one hand, we want to deter them, and we're going to build up military forces to do that, and then the other, we're going to unilaterally disarm on trade and foreign aid and diplomacy because we're going to defund it. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And just kind of one last comment, because, again, what I hope to get out of this is to get enough information that we can help direct some of the foreign policies. And I read an article, and I got chastised for this because I brought it up in this committee. They were talking about how China, as you brought up, Dr. Oslin, how they go in and they build infrastructure, and we focus on other things. And I think it's a misstep of ours. We should go in and build strong infrastructures and develop strong trading partners. And in that process, we'll bring people to our side and meet the goals that we have as far as human rights and things like that. And I think we should focus on that. And then I want to point out to Dr. Swain, and I know you're well aware of this, Robert Gates' book, Duty, there was a section in there they were talking about military sales to Taiwan. And a couple years ago, the Chinese negotiator raised holy Cain because of the military sales, and our negotiator says, why are you making a big fuss over this? We've done this for many years, since '79. And he goes, yes, you did, but we were weak then, we are strong now. And I think we're seeing that presence. And so I think it's imperative that we come to an agreement of what we can do and can't do and forge those strong relationships. And I'm going to turn this over to the ranking member and let him finish, and we have to go vote.
Yep. China will become more nationalistic as it needs to satisfy its own population, and even more nationalistic if they face economic reversals. TPP enshrine the idea that currency manipulation isn't a problem, and its rules of origin provision gave China a chance to have free access to the U.S. market on goods that were to be purportedly only 50% made in China, but as an old accountant, I know that would be 80 or 90%, so 90% of the advantages of her free trade agreement, but at least they'd have a made in Vietnam label put on. We will not put tariffs on China because Wall Street won't let us. We will instead spend $50 billion extra on our military because the Pentagon will want that. And we will meet the domestic needs of the institutions that are most powerful in our society. Wall Street will be happy. The Pentagon will be happy. Beijing will fan nationalism. And Ohio and Western Pennsylvania will suffer. I yield back.
Thank you for your comments. Gentlemen, thank you for being here with your great information that you've helped us cipher through some things. And I look forward to dealing with you more. We have to go vote now. This meeting is adjourned, and thank you.